You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. You're listening to Economics Detective Radio, and today my guest is Michael Heller of Columbia Law School. Michael, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
It's so great to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. So today our discussion is going to focus on Michael's new book. It's entitled Mine: How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives, and it's co-authored with James Salzman. So, Michael, how about you start by giving the sort of a brief overview of the concept of your book? It's about ownership. Why ownership? Why is ownership interesting to you?
Well, I've been teaching and writing about ownership for 25 years, but that's not interesting to you. What I hope is interesting to you and your listeners is that ownership affects each of us every day, every minute of our lives. We make hundreds of ownership decisions a day, and we rarely realize that we're even in the middle of an ownership battle. It's where you live. It's what you eat and drink. It's what you watch and listen to. Ownership is part of every minute when you walk through the world. And our hope with this book is that we give readers the tools to see how ownership really works.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's at the same time super interesting and just so ingrained into our psychology or just our lives. It's almost invisible. Just the sort of assumptions that we're making all the time about ownership, and so it is an interesting topic and an interesting book. So you start out the book with a discussion that lit up the blogosphere a few years back, which is the discussion of who owns the space on an airplane into which a seat can recline. So that sort of wedge of space, if I'm sitting in an airline seat, the space where I might unfold my laptop, but if you're in the seat ahead of me, you might recline into. Which I thought was a really interesting place to start, because it's a place where there's the rules kind of break down and people's intuitions don't all line up. So I think if one airline passenger tried to take another airline passenger's luggage, we'd all agree about who was in the right and who was in the wrong, but people can't seem to agree on the reclining issue. So walk me through that and what it tells us about ownership.
Well, I'm sure, Garrett, you've had the experience of being on a plane and having somebody just lean into your lap and squish your laptop. It's a very unsettling, unpleasant experience. I certainly had that experience many times. I always fly economy. One of the things I realized is when people lean back, or when I lean back into somebody else, I didn't think of that really as an ownership conflict. But as I looked into it some more, I realized that, like everything else in life, all day long, turns out to be a very revealing conflict about who gets what and why in the world. Let me sort of walk you through the airline seat example. So when I lean back, what I'm saying is that space behind the seat is mine. And why is it mine? It's mine because it's attached to something mine. It's attached to the back of my seat. The seat recline button on my seat lets me push back into that space. And you, when this seat comes into your space, you're saying, no, that space is mine. It's mine for my knees, it's mine for my laptop, and when you come into my space, you're trespassing. That's an affront to my sense of space and place. So we're both saying mine, but we're using two very different stories to claim that space. It's mine versus mine, but I'm saying attachment, it's attached to the button, and you're saying possession. I possess that space. It turns out that attachment and possession are two of just 6 simple stories that everyone uses to claim everything in the world. So I don't know if you saw this video. Last year, there was a woman flying to New Orleans, and she leaned back, and the guy behind her was in the last row. He couldn't lean back, and he was totally squished. She started banging her seat like an irritating metronome. She videotaped it. Millions of people watched that videotape. And what's so amazing is that when we polled people afterwards, people split exactly 50-50 on which ownership story they believed. Attachment on the one hand, possession on the other. And it's not just on this example. This comes up all the time whenever people fight about this. They're almost evenly split because mine feels so natural. Both of those stories feel so natural. People are very committed to their position. Often what I find is that the taller people are, the more they want their knee space, and the more tired they are, the more they want to recline. But what nobody realizes, not the person in front or the person in back, is that the airlines have set up this battle for their benefit. They're using one of the most advanced tools of ownership design, a tool that we call deliberate ambiguity. And what deliberate ambiguity lets the airlines do is sell that wedge of space twice on every seat, on every flight. They sell it once for you to recline, and again for me, for my laptop, and for my needs. And what they count on is that we are going to be polite and we're going to work it out between ourselves. And that's what people mostly do in the face of ownership ambiguity. If you don't really know what the rule is, mostly people just try to get along. And airlines count on that reaction so they can double sell that piece of space. And coincidentally, it also makes the business class seats up front even more valuable. That's what creates the market for the space up front is the misery that they create in the back.
Yeah, if I introspect about that situation, I think I'd answer the question differently about who has the right to recline versus versus block the person ahead of them from reclining.
Where do you come out of that?
Yeah, well, if it's 2 a.m., if it's a red-eye flight, the social norms say everyone needs some sleep, everyone's got to recline. Reclining takes precedence over being able to work on your laptop. Actually, working on your laptop, shining a bright light on everyone around you would be quite the faux pas on a red eye. But then if it's, just a quick hop, during the day, most people don't need sleep at that time unless they're flying in from a different time zone, catching a connecting flight. So, yeah, I'd say time of day is important to me, but that's kind of built around, I guess, the needs of the average person or the sort of social norms around it. It's pretty frustrating that the airline would have a back seat that couldn't recline, because implicitly, if it's wrong to squish that guy, the person right ahead of them can't recline, which means the person ahead of them can't, which means the person ahead of them can't, all the way to the front. So that seems to create a lot of conflict that could be solved with just putting in one less seat.
Well, so that's a great observation, Garrett. And here's what's happened. This never used to be a problem. Until a couple of years ago, at least in the American market. Now, you may have more red eyes flying from Australia. Is that where you're flying from?
Oh, no, wait, I'm Canadian.
Okay, I take that back. So maybe you are on more daytime flights.
Oh, well, I'm also super cheap, so I'll take the red eye if I can save like $50.
So there's 2 points that you raised. One, it has to do with the creation of why property gets created in the first place. And property conflicts usually arise as resources get more scarce. That's true for fish in water. That's true for satellite parking spaces up in orbit. And that's also true on airlines. So it used to be that the pitch, the space between seats, was about 35 inches. There was plenty of room. People didn't fight about this. There weren't planes being diverted around midair fights over seat reclining. Today, the pitch on many airplanes is down to about 28 inches, which is barely enough space, and certainly not enough for a larger person or for someone to work on their laptop. So as resources become more scarce, then you tend to see more value in creating property rights definition. And passengers experience that in the form of pushing and pushing back. That's one point. The second point that you raised, which is so cool, which is the point about ownership baselines. What we think about ownership is usually so natural and fixed, but that's often based on a very tenuous baseline, a baseline that flips. So for you, the baseline flips between flying at night and flying during the day. And think about, for example, out in nature. So 100 years ago, when you had standing water, we called that a swamp. Today, when you have standing water, we call it a wetland. When there was a swamp, the baseline, the right thing to do was to fill it in. And today, we leave it open, we leave it as a wetland to basically filter the water and provide biodiversity. So that same resource can have very different meanings if we flip the baseline. That's exactly what's happening on the airplane seat. And on the airplane seat, again, it's a fairly trivial example in the airplane context, but that exact same dilemma, attachment versus possession, those two of the 6 basic ownership stories that everyone uses to claim everything in the world, those 2 stories also define battles today, for example, over our clickstreams, over who owns the data, our likes and looks as we move about online. It may seem like a very different context from the wedge of space behind your seat, but from an ownership perspective, it's the exact same problem. And it gives us the exact same opportunities to push back against, in this case, Google or Amazon, people who are leaning their trackers into our virtual laps.
Oh man, just on the note of internet ownership, it's GDPR is the cookies one, right, in the EU, and they passed that legislation, and now every single website has to ask permission to store cookies on your device, and it's made the internet so annoying to use. I don't think I wanted that right, because I just click yes every time, and it annoys the heck out of me.
That right is perfectly fine for the tech giants. They were perfectly happy giving you that right.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the reason that you say. So the original understanding of clickstreams about this data, this clickstreams are actually the data which power the internet as a whole. Hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars in revenue, ad revenue, derives from the tech company's ability to track your likes and looks. When you buy a ticket to fly to Chicago, and then for the next 2 weeks, everywhere you go on the web, you're seeing ads for Chicago hotels. Well, that ability to claim that clickstream was something that the big tech giants just claimed initially. They're happy to reframe that question as a question of privacy, which is what the European regulation does and which annoys you so much. What privacy does is what forces you actually to click through one more screen before you can get to a site. What the tech giants did not want to have happen, and what we have not yet seen in the world, is to frame clickstreams in terms of ownership rather than privacy. The capitalized value, the value of your individual clickstream, is on the order of hundreds of dollars every year. And that's true for every single one of us in the country. The clickstream is incredibly valuable, and we have no way to get paid for it. We have a way to say, no, don't track me if you don't agree with the cookies. But we have no way to say, yes, let's make a market. I'm prepared to sell you my data in exchange for cash, or in exchange for better service, or in exchange for something. So what we have here is a missing market, and it's one that works very much to the big tech giants' advantage. So they're using the story of attachment. We can push back with possession. But so far, outside of the European example, California and the US, a handful of places have started thinking about this in privacy terms, but no one really has thought very effectively about how to make us owners, how to use one of the 6 simple ownership stories to let us really push back effectively against the tech giants.
So you've mentioned the 6 simple ownership stories, and your book is kind of organized around them into chapters. So let's go through them. You mentioned attachment and possession. Do you want to just kind of quickly list all 6, just so we can sort of get a sense of them?
Sure. So we've mentioned, like we said, we talked about attachment, we talked about possession. The third one is first in time. Like, that's how kids line up at the playground. First in time is one of the oldest and most powerful stories for ownership. It's also a story where, like the tech giants, savvy businesses have really figured out how to design first in time to get you to do what they want. Disney actually is the absolute world's master at managing lines in ways to push you around and then get thanked for it. So first in time is number 3. Number 4 is labor. This goes back to the Bible. You reap what you sow. The notion, this is actually the notion that underlies, for example, why we grant patents to inventors or copyrights to artists, some notion of deserved reward to labor. But it turns out that today, the real rule, much more often, is I reap what you sow. There's many areas of the modern economy with no property rights and enormous amounts of innovation, like fashion or comedians' jokes or coaches' sports plays. They're all very innovative areas, but their labor is not protected. So labor is number 4. Number 5 is self-ownership. It's mine because it comes from my body. Our bodies ourselves. This is so fundamental. And with new medical technologies, we have more and more resources that potentially are very valuable markets, but are caught up in our complex and contradictory and often not really thought through notions about how we think about self-ownership. The sixth and final is family. It's mine because I'm in the family. So you may say something like the meek shall inherit the earth, but that's not really true today. Family ownership is one of the most contested and actually hidden and surprising domains of ownership. This is when wealth is really on the move at birth and at death, at marriage, and at divorce. And that's it. Like all ownership, everyone claims everything using one of those stories: attachment, possession, and first, labor, self-ownership, and family. That's all there is. You put forward one story, first, or self-ownership, and I put forward another, attachment or labor. And we each try to claim the moral high ground because each of those six stories feels so natural and so right. And if we can claim the baseline, if we can say that that standing water is a swamp or a wetland, then we win the battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of, we've talked about like airline seats and sort of just little things just in modern life that people interact with every day. But, if you think of something like the Russian Revolution and, sort of the rise of communism, so much of that is a conflict over people who think that labor it gives you a right to ownership, and that's the most important aspect of ownership, and then see lots and lots of injustice in people doing labor and only getting a wage back and not the product of their labor. And that's like, maybe the central conflict of the 20th century right there. And it's just it's a conflict between, one conception of ownership and another. So there's these conflicts are big and sort of history defining, and yet they come down to these simple factors.
Yeah, so I worked actually for several years, for 4 years, as part of the first team, usually to one of the early teams, to go into socialist countries when they were deciding to rejoin the market system. So I worked in Hungary and Poland and a number of former Soviet republics, including Russia. And the question there was, the eagerness there was very much to think about how these countries could redefine ownership away from socialist law, which made very little your actual personal property, and how to redefine and how to recreate a market system. It turned out that turning communism into capitalism was a little bit like turning, blended fish chowder back into fish. It's very hard to do, and it's been a very painful and contested process. But what's been so fascinating to watch and so hopeful is that people didn't lose track in those countries of the six basic ways, the six basic stories through which ownership really works. Now, they haven't had an easy go of it in many of these places. It's been a real struggle to come up with just systems that protect the vulnerable as they make this transition. But they're doing it on a foundation of a very small handful of ownership stories that people really got very much right away as they started moving back to a market economy.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's sort of like you say, it's like putting the fish back together after you've blended it up. Once you kind of, a lot of these implicit rules are sort of passed down from one generation to the next and embodied in practice, and then if you get rid of that practice, you can't just get it back overnight. So part of what you argue in the book is that these sort of simple stories about ownership they don't quite capture the whole thing. So there's that saying, possession is 9/10 of the law, which I've never quite understood. Maybe because I don't have a background in law, but I kind of, as you point out, it doesn't really hold true. Do you want to provide first explain what does that mean and provide your sort of critique of that?
Well, it's sort of a puzzling expression. Everyone knows it. Let me give you a concrete example. Say you're in a grocery store and you've loaded up your cart and you're going to go check out. And a stranger just comes up to your cart and looks in and says, "Oh, there's the eggs," and takes them out of your cart. And then looks in and says, "Oh, the milk as well. I'll take that too." And then just takes it and starts to walk away. How would you react to that? And my guess is you would be outraged.
Absolutely.
But do you own the stuff in your cart? And the answer is no, you don't, actually. You have no ownership whatsoever. You're still in the store. It's still in your cart. You can walk away from the cart and it wouldn't be yours. So all that you have is mere possession. But that mere possession is incredibly powerful. You get into a fight with a person likely. So possession is 9/10 of the law, is the reality of so much of ownership around us all the time. When you spread your blanket down on the beach and someone nowadays comes too close, comes within 6 feet, you don't own that space on the beach, but yet that possession is so powerful. Possession works like a secret language, something that we're raised in as children, and that becomes a part of us as adults. We all speak the language of possession without even realizing that we are speaking it. The phrase itself, possession is 9/10 of the law, comes from an ancient principle, like pre-Roman. Actually, the earliest codes, the Code of Hammurabi from 4,000 years ago, the earliest codes of law, says that if someone actually uses somebody else's land, possesses it for a long enough time, it becomes theirs. And that rule from 4,000 years ago is the origin of the phrase possession is 9/10 of the law, and it is still the rule today. It is still the rule today where you live and where I live. If somebody else is on your land, using it, farming it, the land becomes their land. Not just like that they're trespassing. At a certain point, they become the owner, based merely on their possession, even if you have the deed. It's really remarkable, and it's true. It's been true throughout history, it's true today, and it's true also for countries. So if you think about territorial conquest, every single piece of land in the world traces back to some dispossession, some genocide, some outrageous historical injustice. But it's that injustice which becomes the root of title. And then going forward, you have a chain of title. So your land today actually traces back ultimately to some original possession, some original seizing of it that wasn't based on any other original story. So possession is one of those stories that is, again, extremely natural, ancient, and very much up for grabs today. So let me give you a modern example that is maybe not about land, but something that's very familiar to all of us. Think about the last time you downloaded a book on Kindle or downloaded a movie from Amazon. It feels like it's yours. You click the buy now button. You have a little shopping cart online, just like you do in the grocery store, and you have a little order now button, and then you eventually click buy now. And when people click that buy now button, they feel as if they own that movie or that book. That download is theirs in the same way that a hard copy is a physical copy. But here's the difference. Amazon or Apple, they can't come into your house and take away a physical copy of your book. You can cut up your book, make a collage. You can burn it in protest. You can lend it to friends. But online, none of those things are true. You have very, very limited uses. And even more so, Apple or Amazon, they can just delete the book or movie right off of your device without any compensation to you. That's actually part of what you agreed when you click buy now. A recent study suggested or found that almost 85% of people, almost everybody, believes that buying something online is the same as buying a physical copy of it. And that is just not true. And because it's not true, the online vendors, they're earning an extra premium on every download. There's a growing gap between what you feel you own and what you actually own. And that gap can be priced. And that price is something that we all pay without realizing it to the online vendors.
Yeah, there's a real problem that comes out of these end user license agreements that everybody just clicks I accept on. It used to be that a contract was a contract and you read through it and you were diligent and careful and made sure you didn't agree to anything you didn't want. But just the volume of legalese that gets thrown at a person. If you tried to read every license agreement for every product you use, you just would run out of hours in the day, and it wouldn't benefit you at all. And so we fall back on these intuitions because it's just so much easier than actually reading the agreements we've made with Amazon. I think there was a South Park episode where people clicked the license agreement and accidentally agreed to be the butler to Bill Gates or something.
They're written not to be read. I teach this stuff, and I assure you I have never read one. And that's part of the point. When we think about ownership out in the world, law is extremely overrated. Most of us, again, have hundreds of these conflicts every day. It's how you line up to get your coffee at Starbucks. It's whether you can lean back on the airplane. It's what you do when you've lost or found a wallet. And none of those examples ever involve any recourse to law. 99.99% of ownership conflicts do not involve law. And that is also true when you think about online licenses. Nobody reads them. They're not designed to be read. But people fall back on, again, is these very simple stories. They fall back on intuitions about renting something versus buying something. People use shorthand to get through their day. And that ownership shorthand, I've bought it, is exactly where savvy businesses are able to use ownership engineering to basically evoke your instinct about possession without giving you the reality of that. That's what's so powerful about ownership, is that you feel as if you are right in the world of this is mine, but the companies that are dealing with you absolutely know otherwise. That's why the airlines leave the ambiguous who owns that wedge of space, because they know how you're going to react. They know that you're going to try to be polite with your neighbor. That's how Amazon, that's why they have the little design of the shopping cart. They are masters at using our deep intuitions that go back not just to childhood, but go back to our animal territoriality. Those instincts are so deep and so powerful, though it's that which lets us get through our day without too much hassle. Like we slide through these hundreds of conflicts, we line up for the Starbucks coffee, we don't have to argue about it, but because they are so powerful, and because they are so open to being redesigned by savvy owners, that power is part of the hidden story of ownership that I'm so eager for your listeners to get more access to.
Yeah. So I wanted to discuss one more thing in the book that you touch on, which is related to the self-ownership concept. You have a discussion of why Americans in particular are allowed to sell their blood plasma, but not their kidneys. Canadians actually are not allowed to sell blood plasma. And as a result, we have a huge deficit of it and get imported all from paid donors in the United States. Longtime listeners will know that I've had multiple episodes on this topic. So what's your sort of explanation for that discrepancy, and how does it relate to these core ownership concepts?
Well, self-ownership is really one of the most personal and complicated stories that we have. So even within a family, you will have very different views on whether or not blood should be sold, or kidneys, or sperm, or eggs. And that's because what people are doing is they're relying on different visions of what my co-author Jim Salzman and I call the sacred and the profane. So the history of self-ownership is mostly a sort of a very history filled with tragedy. Right? So self-ownership for most of time was people owning other people. The history of slavery is deep in our understanding of self-ownership. And there's been a very long arc of people struggling for formal legal equality. For African Americans struggling to be free from slavery, from women struggling to be equal citizens with men, in particular with husbands. with Native Americans struggling for equality as well. And for nowadays, and most recently for same-sex couples struggling for equality with opposite-sex couples. So in each of those battles, what we've seen is a long move to bring formal equality to groups that were basically not white men, to have everybody have the status and privileges in this country that white men have always, white men of property have always had. White men without property did not have some of those privileges early on in American history. So it's that backdrop, the backdrop of the fight over people owning other people, that actually informs so much of the debate about self-ownership today. And it's only recently, in the last few decades, that we've had new forms of resources that are separate from the body, but come from the body. So our intuitions about those resources still, I think, are very much in formation. On the one hand, you have the sort of sense of the sacred, this is where I use that it is wrong. It's wrong to instrumentalize people, to use people in service of another in that direct a way. You can employ them, but you can't enslave them. So that's one end of the spectrum. And at the other end, you have so many things that are in markets. So why not various body parts? Why not plasma or kidneys? And the instinct there is people take really crummy and dangerous jobs. They work horrible jobs. So if we're willing to let people do that, and they would prefer to have it be a better job for them to be donating plasma, who are we to not allow them to do that? So that would be the profane side, the sacred and profane, the two sort of ends of the spectrum of self-ownership. And here's what we found in writing this book, which is that the way most people think about this is like an on-off switch. So for each organ, we either switch on, which is to say market sales, or we say off, no sales whatsoever. So how you come down then is guided by that on-off image of ownership. But that's not the way that ownership really works. Ownership is much more of a dimmer switch, much less of an on-off switch. So it's possible to create intermediate categories between full market ownership, like a mug or a rake, and no ownership at all, like we have for no slavery. And it's that space in between where you see a lot of the most creative opportunities for ownership engineering for the common good. Even in American states as well, you have a big variety about what can be sold from the human body. So as you cross the border from Wyoming to Montana, it turns out that stem cells from your blood are legal in one state and illegal to be sold in another. As you cross the border from Michigan to Wisconsin, a woman cannot be, it's illegal to be a paid surrogate to carry somebody else's baby to term in her womb in Michigan. And it's just an ordinary business transaction in neighboring states. And you see this over and over between countries and within America, between states, over how to decide what is the appropriate level to place that switch. And mostly what you see is states and governments and countries flipping the switch up or down, sacred or profane, and missing the sort of creative opportunities for addressing really important social needs that have only recently been possible to address when you have medical technology that is not degrading, does not enslave people, but has the potential to save an enormous number of lives. Plasma is one part of that, stem cells is another, regenerative organs like sperm is a third. Hair is not controversial, but as you go through different body parts, you have all different controversies that are addressed very poorly in the literature, very poorly, I think, in public debate, because we're still so stuck on this very simple on-off switch image of ownership.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. As you point out, slavery is, it's something that goes deep back into human history. And so is the idea of possession, right? And so with your various kind of types of ownership, the idea of self-ownership seems like something that is not sort of innate, not something that goes back deep into history and is shared by chimps and bonobos, but something that we've sort of come to in the modern era because the alternative of some people owning other people is just so horrifying. Whereas the idea that, if I'm the ape who's holding the banana, it's my banana. That's just couldn't be more simple and more intuitive.
That's absolutely right. So, these ownership stories, the 6 of them have different histories, different sort of deep histories in our culture. The self-ownership one goes very far back. If you think, for example, of the philosopher Locke, for him, all ownership actually is rooted in the human body. The reason we own our labor is because we own our bodies. That's the origin of a lot of modern intellectual property. The notion of copyrights and patents, all the stuff you download, is based on that sort of very deep notion of labor, which is in turn is based on this very deep notion of ultimately being your own self-owner.
Yeah, and but with this conflict, if you're a Lockean, it really seems like there's just no reason why you shouldn't be able to sell a kidney. You own yourself; it's part of yourself. You can sell it, and similar. I think on this podcast, with discussions I've had, the focus is always on consequentialism and how many lives could be saved by compensating organ donors, how many people are on the wait list, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a concept from psychology, the concept of a body envelope violation. Just when you cut someone open or kind of violate their body in some way, we have kind of a disgust response. Many people have a disgust response to it, not everyone. And so there's a sort of gross out factor to cutting to even taking a kidney out of someone. And then when you kind of add in, make it transactional and make person A pay person B for it, just kind of it grosses a lot of people out. And I think a lot of the arguments around that kind of stem from that sort of factor, the gross out factor.
Yeah, that's right. I think the counter side always, of course, is the thousands of people who died waiting for organs who could be saved if there were if it were possible to create a well-regulated market that addressed the very deep concerns that we have about coercion and degradation that come from those markets. It may not be possible to address those concerns, but if it is, it might be possible to create an ownership regime that both respected people's fundamental dignity and at the same time saved thousands of lives. I think there's a disgust factor as well with the thousands of people who we just neglect on medically, who have so much need, and potentially we could be so much more helpful for them. That's also very problematic on the other side. Now, this is a sort of thing where one of the threads of our conversation today has been about ownership baselines. So with gestational surrogacy, which is another resource that comes from the body, gestational surrogate is a woman who carries another couple's embryo. Often that's the only way same-sex couples can have children, but also for many opposite-sex couples, the only safe way or possible way to have a child is to create an embryo and then implant it in a woman who carries the baby to term. Now, the baseline for that until fairly recently was very skeptical and viewed in a sort of way that some people maybe view selling kidneys as simply wrong or as enslaving a woman to another couple's goals. But that has shifted actually very quickly in America to the point where now there's only a handful of states, actually New York, where I'm calling in from, just this year shifted the rule from having gestational surrogacy be essentially banned or very difficult to being actually quite supported in the law. So these notions of what's sacred and what's profane around the body, they're both very visceral, very powerful, very instinctual, very deep, and they are open to real change. And when that change happens, it can change very quickly. So now actually the U.S. is, in many states, gestational surrogacy is mostly reasonably safe. It has a certain level of complexity and pain and some danger, but it's something that women who choose to can use as a way to supplement their income. And for most women who are surrogates, it is still, as it should be, mostly an altruistic gesture. The sort of joy of bringing a child to another family, something that motivates most gestational surrogates, even when they are also paid for their services. But that shift, that change from one baseline of ownership to another is something that is maybe even more visible in the area of self-ownership than in many other areas of ownership that we've talked about today, because it does tap into exactly those sort of very basic moral feelings that we've talked about and that you raised a little bit earlier.
My guest today has been Michael Heller. Michael, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
It is such a pleasure to be here with you. I look forward to talking with you again.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio. If you're just listening to this show for the first time, I encourage you to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We have lots more episodes, although I might not be recording them quite as frequently right now because my wife and I recently had a baby. He's 2 weeks old and he is very, very cute, but of course he takes a lot of time and energy away from hobbies like podcasting. So I'll try to release episodes when I can, but we'll see. Big thanks to everyone who supports the show on Patreon, and to everyone who listens and who subscribes and who tells their friends about the show. That really helps me to keep producing it, and I really like doing it. So we'll see where the show goes in the future, but I'm not going to end it for sure. Just might not release quite as frequently. Thanks, and I'll be back when I'm back.